Listen closely, because this is the kind of secret people we're never supposed to hear. In the winter of 1885, behind the glittering facade of New York's Fifth Avenue, a woman named Elilana Fairchild stepped into a nightmare so deep it swallowed not just her fortune, but her very mind. Her mansion was a palace of gold and limestone, its windows glowing with candlelight and wealth. But inside those walls, shadows whispered. Deals were struck in hushed voices. And the woman who believed she was building a legacy would soon discover she was nothing more than a pawn in a game that had already claimed her husband's life. This is not a story of high society glamour. It is the story of what happens when you see too much and know too much. When you begin to realize that the wealth of nations, the power of dynasties, and the gilded glory of an empire are built on something darker than ambition. Built on corruption, built on blood, built on secrets too dangerous to tell. If you found this video, it means you were meant to hear what others tried to bury. So pay attention, because the deeper we go, the more dangerous it becomes. And once you hear these words, you can't unhear them. Before we continue, stop right now and make sure you've subscribed. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the truth you're about to discover has been silenced for more than a century. And if we vanish from the algorithm, you'll know why. Now, let's step into the mansion. The night of November 17th, 1885. The night that began Elilana Fairchild's fall into madness. The dining room is glowing with crystal, silver, and candle flames. But beneath the laughter and fine wine, something is wrong. The city's most powerful bankers sit at her table, whispering of the Pittsburgh problem and permanent solutions. Her husband Theodore's hands tremble as he raises his glass. His eyes dart, haunted as though he knows what's coming. Then, the gasp, the collapse, the scream. Wine spilling like blood across white linen. And in that instant, everything she thought she knew about her life, her love, and her world died with him. But this was only the beginning. The official story was simple, too simple. A heart attack, they said. The pressures of high finance finally broke the man, known as the Oracle of Exchange Place. The newspapers praised Theodore Fairchild as a titan of the Gilded Age, brilliant, fearless, taken too soon. A cautionary tale wrapped neatly for the public. But the widow knew better. Elilana could not forget the terror frozen in her husband's eyes. Eyes that pleaded, eyes that tried to speak but failed. She could not ignore the way the banker Harrison Kensington whispered in the physician's ear, or how the wine glass, the very one Theodore had sipped from before collapsing, vanished from the table, never to be seen again. This was not grief's imagination. This was precision, efficiency, a cover-up executed in real time, while she was still on her knees, screaming beside his body. And when the mansion emptied, when the condolences faded, she was left alone with questions no one wanted answered. Why did business rivals defer to her husband with almost military obedience? Why did his investments bloom only when his competitors' lives and fortunes were ruined? Why were men of power speaking of problems that needed to be resolved permanently? Elilana's grief sharpened into suspicion, and suspicion sharpened into obsession. She began tearing through her husband's papers, hunting for a truth that seemed to hide just beyond the candlelight. What she found chilled her blood. Stock sales that anticipated catastrophic train derailments. Investments made days before, rival factories burned. Partnerships signed mere hours before political assassinations shifted entire markets. Theodore's uncanny foresight wasn't foresight at all, it was privilege. Privilege of knowledge, privilege of secrets. Privilege of a circle so powerful that it could bend the world to its will. And now, her discovery made her dangerous. Because once you pull the first thread of a hidden order, you cannot stop. The tapestry unravels itself. But as each night, she stayed. Awake in her late husband's study, sifting through coded telegrams, anonymous letters, and chilling phrases like "the problem has been resolved" or "payment rendered for decisive action." They weren't notes of commerce, they were records of orchestrated death. The deeper she dug, the more the walls of the mansion began to feel like a cage. She could sense eyes on her, footsteps in hallways, whispers from servants who wouldn't meet her gaze. She had inherited not only Theodore's wealth, but his enemies and his unfinished sins. And soon, the widow would realize the price of forbidden knowledge. By January of 1886, Elena Fairchild was no longer a grieving widow. She was an investigator, driven by a hunger that devoured her sleep and her sanity. The fire of suspicion had burned away her mourning veil, leaving only a woman staring into the abyss of power and realizing it was staring back. Inside Theodore's locked drawer, she found the kind of evidence that doesn't belong in polite society. Handwritten notes cataloging disasters before they happened. Industrial accidents marked as planned resolutions. Lists of men competitors. Politicians, factory owners crossed out like names erased from history. And letters signed only with initials, as if the men behind them believed anonymity would shield them from judgment. But the most chilling of all was a letter marked H.K. Harrison Kensington. The silver-haired banker who had stood beside her, consoling her as her husband's body was still warm. The letter spoke of the Pittsburgh problem and the need for swift, permanent action. The exact words she had overheard that night at the dining table. Her blood ran cold. These men weren't financiers, they were engineers of destiny. They were market assassins, orchestrating accidents, strikes, and deaths too. Tilt the scales of wealth in their favor. Theodore hadn't just been a titan of industry, he had been a willing conspirator in something far more sinister. And now, she held the proof. But with proof came danger. Doors began to close around her. Invitations to social gatherings evaporated. Friends who once begged for a seat at her dinner table now crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers of hysteria and madness began to trail her like perfume. The narrative was being prepared not just about Theodore's death, but about her mind. Because when you threaten the order, they don't just bury you, they erase you. First your credibility, then your voice. Finally, your life. Elena began to feel eyes watching her every move. Servants she didn't recognize appeared in the house, claiming to have been sent by Kensington to help manage affairs. Letters she had hidden were moved, rearranged, as if someone had been rifling through them while she slept. Even Dr. Henley, the physician who had declared Theodore dead, began visiting more often, probing her with questions about her nerves, her dreams, her delicate constitution. The walls were closing in. Her wealth made her powerful, but her knowledge made her expendable. And it was only a matter of time before the widow realized she was no longer an observer of Theodore's conspiracy. She was the next problem. To be resolved, spring crept into New York in 1886. But for Elena Fairchild, the season brought no renewal, only shadows that stretched longer and darker across her life. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, once a monument of power and prestige, had become a labyrinth of surveillance. She noticed it in the smallest of details. A drawer left slightly ajar that she was certain she had locked. A servant hesitating just long enough to suggest they had overheard too much. A letter folded differently than she remembered. Each incident was minor in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern, a net tightening around her. But then came the moment that confirmed her fears. One evening, while combing through Theodore's papers, she uncovered a cipher. It was hidden in plain sight, disguised as a column of financial figures. Yet when she aligned the numbers against dates of industrial accidents, the truth revealed itself. These weren't investments. They were calculations of disaster. Her husband and his circle had been profiting from orchestrated chaos, measuring lives in columns of profit and loss. She felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The grandeur of the Gilded Age mansions, the railroads. The glittering parties were nothing more than a stage curtain. Behind it, a machine churned endlessly, fueled by death, misery, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. Night sleep would not come. She paced the halls of her mansion, listening to the creaks and whispers of the house. until she was certain she heard footsteps that were not her own. From the corner of her eye, a shadow flickered past a doorway. When she pursued it, the corridor was empty. Yet on her writing desk, the cipher she had worked so carefully to decode was gone. In its place, a single white card. No writing, no name. Just the symbol of an eye, staring back at her, watching, her breath caught in her throat. This was no accident. This was a warning. A message delivered directly to her study inside her own house. Suddenly she understood she was not researching them. They were studying her, testing how far she would go, how much she would uncover before she either surrendered to silence, was silenced. Still, fear did not drive her into retreat. It hardened her resolve. If her husband had been a conspirator, then his death was. Not the end of the story, it was the opening of a door. And now, she was stepping through it, deeper into the abyss. What she didn't know was that once a door like that opens, it never closes again. By the summer of 1886, Elenina Fairchild had crossed a line she could never return from. She was no longer a silent widow piecing together fragments in her study. She was a woman who had begun speaking the unspeakable, hinting at truths polite society could not tolerate. And in the Gilded Age, there was no greater crime than naming the hand that fed the empire. It began with whispers at dinner parties. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. Why did Theodore sell shares hours before a rival's factory burned? Why did Kensington always seem untouched by financial panics that ruined everyone else? Her voice, once celebrated for elegance and charm, now carried a sharp edge that unsettled her peers. Smiles froze on faces, glasses paused mid-air, and conversations stumbled into awkward silence whenever she dared speak. Soon, she was uninvited from gatherings that had once defined her identity. Former friends began describing her as unstable, consumed by grief, perhaps slipping into hysteria. The whispers spread faster than any truth she could offer. This was the first stage of erasure. Not to kill the body, but to kill the reputation. But Eleanor refused to retreat. If the salons of New York would not listen, she would seek allies elsewhere. She began frequenting libraries, digging into records of unexplained industrial accidents. She reached out to journalist radicals on the fringes of respectability, who had long suspected collusion between finance and death, but lacked proof. Proof that now sat locked inside her study, encoded telegrams and ledgers dripping with implication. Yet with every move she made, the watchers closed in tighter. Strangers appeared outside her mansion at night, leaning against lampposts with the stillness of men waiting for orders. Her carriage wheels were tampered with, nearly sending her crashing into the East River. And always the doctor arrived uninvited, pressing his professional concern. "You're not well, Mrs. Fairchild. You must rest. You must allow others to handle your affairs." But she would not rest. She would not hand over her inheritance, her voice, or her sanity. To retreat was death of the soul. To advance, though dangerous, was the only way to preserve it. So she pressed forward each discovery, another nail in her own coffin. Revelation, another step deeper into the forbidden. She began to understand something terrifying. This was never about her husband's death. His fall had been one move in a much older, much larger game. A system of control that thrived on orchestrated chaos. And as she stared into that abyss, she realized something even darker. She was not just a widow uncovering her husband's secrets. She was becoming part of the story, absorbed into the machinery, marked as a threat, destined to be either erased or remade. There comes a moment in every story of forbidden truth where the veil rips and there is no going back. For Elenina Fairchild, that moment came when she realized she was not fighting grief. Not even corruption, she was fighting an entire system designed to shape perception, dictate reality, to erase dissent before it could even speak its first word. And here's the part you need to understand. The system she uncovered did not die with the Gilded Age. It never ended. It simply refined itself, adapted, perfected the art of control. The tools may have changed, but the method remains the same. Control the narrative, silence the inconvenient, and reduce rebellion to madness. She was labeled unstable because that is how institutions defend themselves, by pathologizing truth-tellers. Call them hysterical, call them paranoid, call them insane. Do anything but admit that they are right. And here is where I speak to you. Because if you are still here, if you are still listening, then you already feel the pull of this descent. You've heard the whispers. You've seen the cracks in the perfect surface. And like her, you are standing at the edge of something that changes you forever. So I'm going to ask you to prove it, to seal this transformation. I now type. The phrase "I see the eye" in the comments twice. Not once, twice. Because repetition is power. Because ritual is what locks awareness into identity. Once you write it, you are no longer just a viewer, you are a witness. A man who cannot go back to sleep after seeing what stares from behind the curtain. Do it now, because this is the threshold. Nina crossed hers when she confronted the men directly. Not with screams, not with accusations, but with quiet defiance. She told Kensington she had read the letters. She told Dr. Henley she no longer trusted his concern. And in that instant, she signed her own death warrant, not with ink, but with courage. From that moment forward, she was not merely being watched. She was being hunted. And once the hunters marked her, the descent into madness was no longer just a possibility. It was destiny. Once the hunters marked her, the game changed. Elenina Fairchild was no longer a wealthy widow managing an estate. She was a liability that needed to be neutralized. And the system had perfected the art of neutralization, not through assassins in the dark, not yet, but through something far more insidious: social exile, psychological erosion, and the slow construction of a narrative that made her invisible even while she screamed the truth. It began subtly. Newspapers that once carried flattering sketches of her gowns and her soirees now published veiled comments about her fragile nerves. Journalists whispered about erratic behavior and episodes of instability. Former friends repeated these rumors until they became fact. And in the parlors of Fifth Avenue, the question wasn't if she had gone mad, but when she would be committed. Her mansion grew colder, emptier. Servants resigned mysteriously, replaced by strangers whose loyalty was not to her but to the men who paid them. Conversations hushed the moment she entered a room. Letters she sent were never answered. Doors that had once opened at her arrival now remained firmly shut. Isolation is not silence. It is a scream no one answers. And slowly, her sense of reality began to bend beneath the weight of it. She doubted herself. Was she imagining the watchers in the street? Were the footsteps at night only echoes in her mind? Or was the madness they spoke of not an illness, but a weapon being used against her? And here's the truth they never wanted her or you to realize. When a system wants to destroy a person, it doesn't simply eliminate them. It dismantles their identity piece by piece. It convinces the world they're unreliable, untrustworthy, unwell, so that by the time they are silenced, no one dares to question why. For Elenina, the breaking point came one evening when she discovered her husband's cipher documents missing from her locked drawer. In their place, another white card with the eyes staring back. This time, a single word was scrawled beneath it: soon. Her hands trembled as she held it, but it wasn't fear that consumed her, it was clarity. She understood now that she was not paranoid. She was correct. Every move she had made, the letter she had read, every word she had whispered into the wrong ear, had been observed, tracked, calculated. She had been placed on the board not as a player, but as a piece. And pieces are meant to be sacrificed. The summer heat pressed down on New York like a suffocating hand. And inside the Fairchild mansion, Elenina's world cracked. Until now, the war had been fought in whispers, in rumors, in shadows behind curtains. But when silence failed to break her, the system advanced to its next move: violence. It began with her carriage. One morning, she instructed the driver to take her to the offices of a radical journalist. Of the few men willing to hear her story, but halfway down Broadway, the horses bolted in terror. The wheels split with a metallic snap, sending the carriage careening toward the river. Only by sheer chance and the frantic grip of a stranger was she dragged free before the plunge. The driver swore the bolts had been filed down deliberately. A warning, a reminder that accidents were tools in the arsenal of the powerful.
Days.
Later, she awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of glass shattering. A rock had been hurled through her window. Tied to it was a slip of paper. "Stop digging." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the meaning was unmistakable. The watchers no longer hid in lamplight shadows, they were inside her walls. Her mind, once razor-sharp with determination, began to splinter. Was the whisper she heard in the hall a servant? Or an intruder? Were the footsteps outside her bedroom real? Or echoes of her own frantic pulse? Each night became a test of endurance. Each day a performance of composure to mask the unraveling storm within. And yet, the more reality frayed. The more she saw the machinery for what it was. Not random cruelty, but calculated theater. The accident, the threats, the whispers of madness, each was a lever, a gear, a part of a system designed to push her. Toward one outcome? Collapse. They didn't need to kill her outright. All they needed was for her to break. To validate the story they had already written for her. Her journals from this time read like a descent into shadow. Frantic sketches of eyes, half-finished ciphers scrawled across margins, desperate notes like "they will erase me before they erase the truth." And perhaps the most terrifying realization of all was this: the more they pushed her toward madness, the more powerful her knowledge became. Because only a woman on the edge of sanity could see clearly what others refused to see, that the wealth of the age was nothing but gilded rot, and those who ruled it would sacrifice anyone, at any cost, to protect their illusion. Soon, Eleanor's Fairchild was no longer just a widow investigating her husband's death. She had become the embodiment of a truth too dangerous to exist, and that made her inevitable. By the autumn of 1886, Elena Fairchild was no longer regarded as a grieving widow. She was a woman unmoored, a whisper of scandal in parlors, a name spoken in the same tone as illness. And yet behind the rumors, something undeniable stirred her defiance, had made her dangerous. She had stepped too far, spoken too openly, carried proof that was never meant to see daylight. And so, the circle closed around her. It happened one evening at a private gathering, a dinner at the Kensington estate, to which she was invited with deliberate precision. The message was clear. She was still allowed to sit at the table, but only because they wanted her there. The room was heavy with velvet curtains, tobacco smoke, the subtle weight of men who had decided the fate of nations with a glance. She felt their eyes on her before anyone spoke. The laughter was too polished, the smiles too wide, the silence between words too deliberate. And then Kensington himself leaned close, his voice like oil across the tablecloth. "You've been restless?" Eleanor, curious. "But curiosity, my dear, can be fatal in a city like ours." Every man at the table chuckled, as if it were merely a joke. But in their eyes she saw something colder. Verdict, execution, inevitability. That night, as she left the mansion, she swore she saw the same white card tucked into the hand of the butler as he closed the door. The eye, watching, always watching. Her mind, already fraying, shattered further under the weight of inevitability. Was she already dead, walking the corridors of her home like a ghost waiting for the final blow? In her journal, the handwriting splintered into chaos lines that spiraled into eyes, numbers that no longer formed equations but spirals. And one phrase repeated until the ink bled through the paper: "I am not mad. I am not mad." But perhaps the most haunting entry was her last complete sentence. "They do not kill you because you are insane. They drive you insane so that when they kill you, no one cares." Within weeks, she vanished from public life. Some said she was taken quietly to a sanitarium upstate, lost in the corridors of medicine and whispers. Others claim she fled the country, carrying her husband's cipher to those who might still listen. But the truth, the real truth, was buried beneath the same machinery she had fought. The newspapers printed only what they were told. The widow Fairchild, after prolonged suffering, has been committed for her own health. Her mansion was sold. Her name was erased from society's lips. And in the records of power, her file was closed with a single mark of ink, silenced. And yet, her story did not die, because here you are, still listening, still reading, still hearing the whispers of a woman who refused to bend even as the system broke her. Perhaps that is her legacy, not victory, not survival, but the proof that dissent itself is a weapon. That madness, whether real or manufactured, can still illuminate the truth. The question is yours to answer. Do you see the eye? Or does the eye see you? History likes to bury its ghosts. It stamps official stories onto the record, seals them with dates and signatures, and calls the matter closed. But history is never closed, only waits. Fairchild vanished into silence, but the machinery that swallowed her did not vanish. It refined itself. It grew more sophisticated. In her time, the tools were whispers, newspapers, and locked doors. Today, the tools are different, but the purpose remains the same. Discredit the witness, control the narrative, erase the inconvenient. You've seen it. Perhaps you've even felt it, the way certain truths are mocked before they are examined. The way those who question too loudly are branded unstable, conspiratorial, insane. The patterns are the same. The gears of the machine still turn, and the eye still watches. That is why Leyla story matters. Not because she won, she didn't. Not because she survived, she didn't. But because her descent revealed the pattern. She proved in her unraveling that madness is not always illness. Sometimes it is clarity, too sharp for the world to accept. And now, that burden is no longer hers. It is yours. If you've listened this far, if you've felt the weight of her voice across centuries, then you are already part of the circle. You've crossed the same threshold she crossed. Cannot unsee what you've seen. So I'll ask you one final time. Look into the comments. See who else has written the words. And then add your own. Not once. Twice. Seal the ritual. Prove that you, too, see the eye. Because Leyla Fairchild was never just a widow. She was the first to descend. And now, the descent continues through you.